She set her bag at the foot of the bed like she had already decided something I had not agreed to yet. There was only one bed in the room, low and wide under a window that looked out on the black ridgeline above Missoula, and I stood in the doorway holding my duffel and my case of gauges like I might still be able to back out into the hallway and pretend none of this had happened. Jo did not look rattled. She looked at the mattress, then at me, then back at the mattress, and she said, "Guess we have no choice," in the same flat, unbothered voice she used when she read a burn pattern out loud to a room full of insurance adjusters who did not want to hear what she was about to tell them. I laughed, but it came out wrong, more like air escaping something. 6 months of watching her work a fire scene 40 feet from mine. 6 months of telling myself it meant nothing, and now the front desk had put us in one room with one bed, and she was already unzipping her bag like the whole thing was a scheduling problem and nothing more. Let me back up. My name is Everett Doss, and what I do matters more than what I'm called, which is walk into places that used to be forests and figure out why they aren't anymore. I have been a wildfire origin investigator for 16 years. I get called after the smoke clears and the news trucks leave, when what remains is char and ash, and a county or an insurance company that wants an answer nobody can give with total certainty. I work mostly alone, out of a truck that smells like diesel and burnt pine no matter how many times I wash it. I am 38 years old. I was married once, for 8 years, to a woman named Renata, who did not do anything wrong except fall in love with a man who kept driving towards smoke instead of staying home. Renata used to say I loved fires more than I loved her, and for a long time I thought that was an exaggeration born out of loneliness, the kind of thing a tired spouse says at 11 at night when the porch light has been on for 4 hours. But looking back now, I think she was closer to the truth than either of us wanted to admit. A fire scene never asks anything of you except attention. It does not need you to remember an anniversary or notice a haircut. It just sits there, patient and burned, waiting for someone who knows how to read it. I was good at reading fires. I was not good at reading people, and I told myself that was a separate skill I would learn eventually. The way you tell yourself you will get around to fixing the fence. When Renata left, she took the dog and the good coffee maker and left me the house and a folding table full of my father-in-law's old tools, which I never used, and one thing that actually mattered to me, which had nothing to do with her at all. That was a brass char depth gauge that had belonged to my mentor, a man named Walt Pruitt, who trained me when I was 22 and green and terrified of every fire scene I walked into. Walt died the year before my divorce. Heart trouble, sitting in his recliner with the television on, and he left me his gauge in a manila envelope taped shut with a note that said only, "You'll know what to do with this." The gauge is nothing fancy. It is a folding brass tool about the length of my hand, used to measure how deep a fire burned into wood, which tells you how long the fire sat in one place, which tells you, if you know how to listen, where it started and how it moved. I carry it in my left jacket pocket on every job. I have carried it so long the brass has gone the color of an old penny where my thumb rests. The strange part was that I never talked about Walt with Renata. Not really. Not the way I should have. I told her he died. I did not tell her what it felt like the first time I opened that envelope, or that I sometimes drove out to a burn scar just to stand in it and think about what he would have said about the pattern on the ground. There is a version of my marriage where I explained that to her and she understood, and there is the version that actually happened where I kept it folded up small inside myself the way you fold a gauge shut when the work is done. What nobody tells you about grief tangled up with a failing marriage is that it is hard to know, afterward, which one you are actually mourning. After the divorce, I built a life that fit inside a truck cab and a duffel bag, and for 3 years that suited me fine. I took jobs across 4 states. I learned the particular loneliness of motel ice machines at midnight. I got used to being the person who shows up after the disaster, asks quiet questions, and leaves before anyone learns much about him beyond his findings. And then, a year and a half ago, a county north of Helena hired 2 investigators for the same fire. because the acreage was large enough and the liability questions messy enough that they wanted a second opinion working the scene at the same time as mine. That second opinion turned out to be a woman named Josephine Calloway, who went by Jo, and who worked for a competing firm out of Bozeman called Basin Fire Consulting. I had heard of her before I met her. In this business, which is smaller than people think, everybody has heard of everybody, and what I had heard about Jo Calloway was that she was thorough to the point of stubbornness, and that she had once told a courtroom, under oath, that a fire chief's official report was wrong and been proven right 2 years later when new evidence turned up. That kind of thing makes you either respected or resented in this field, and from what I gathered, Jo had earned some of both. What I did not expect, walking up to that burn scar north of Helena and seeing her crouched at the edge of it with a notebook and a headlamp, even though it was broad daylight, was how much I would like watching her work. She did not introduce herself the way most people do. She looked up, said, "You're the other one," and went back to sketching the char pattern on the ground. I told her my name. She said hers without looking up again. And then, because I did not know what else to do, I crouched down about 10 feet from her and started my own survey of the scene, and for the next 2 hours we worked in a kind of parallel silence, each of us circling the same burned acre from opposite directions, occasionally calling out a measurement or a question the way you might to a coworker you had known for years instead of 10 minutes. What I didn't know was that this would become a pattern over the following year and a half, the two of us assigned or drawn to the same fires, competing for the same contracts, working the same scorched ground from different angles, and somehow never quite becoming strangers to each other again. Here's the thing about being a competitor to someone in a field this small. You see them enough that you start to notice things you have no right noticing. I noticed that Jo drank her coffee black and complained about it every single time. I noticed she had a habit of tucking her pencil behind her ear when she was thinking hard, and that she always forgot it was there and went looking for a second one. I noticed that she was better than me at reading wind patterns, and I was better than her at reading char depth, and that when we disagreed on a scene, which was often, she argued like she respected me. Sharp and specific, never dismissive. I noticed, 6 months in, that I had started looking forward to hearing which firm had been assigned to a fire before I even knew the details of the fire itself. Because if it was Basin Fire Consulting, it probably meant her. That was the moment I should have paid attention to, but I didn't. Not really, because admitting it would have meant admitting something about myself I had built 3 careful years around not being. I had rules by then, rules I had never written down but followed like scripture. Rule 1 was that I did not get involved with anyone connected to the job, because Renata had taught me that mixing the two things ends badly for whoever loves you. Rule 2 was that I did not let anyone else touch Walt's gauge, because it was the one thing I had left that felt uncomplicated. A piece of another man's steady hands passed into mine, and I was not going to let it get tangled up in anything that might end the way my marriage ended. Rule 3. The newest one, the one I made specifically because of Jo, was that I did not think about a competitor as anything other than a competitor. Because Jo Calloway and I were, on paper, opponents. Her firm and my independent practice bid against each other for the same contracts more often than not. Falling for her would not just be inconvenient, it would be a conflict of interest with a heartbeat. I kept Rule 3 for about 4 months, which, looking back now, is a laughably short amount of time to hold a line I had convinced myself was unbreakable. The first crack came at a conference in Spokane, of all unglamorous places, where we ended up at the same folding table during a lunch break because every other seat in the room was full. She asked me, apropos of nothing, whether the gauge in my jacket pocket was the one she'd seen me use on the Helena fire. I told her it was. She asked whose it had been before it was mine, because she said it looked too old and too loved to be something I'd bought new, and something about the way she said too loved instead of worn out made my chest do something I did not have a name for yet. I told her about Walt. I told her more than I meant to, about the manila envelope and the note and the way I still sometimes talk to him out loud on long drives. She did not say anything comforting or soft. She just nodded, like a woman filing away a fact she intended to remember, and said, "That's a good thing to carry." And then she went back to her sandwich like we had discussed nothing more significant than the weather, and I sat there feeling like she had reached into my jacket pocket without ever touching it. The strange part was how ordinary the moments were that kept chipping away at Rule 3 after that. It was never anything dramatic. It was her remembering, weeks later, that I preferred gas station coffee to the fancy stuff because Walt used to say fancy coffee made a man soft in the field, and her buying me a cup of the worst gas station coffee in Kalispell just to make me laugh. It was the two of us ending up at the same diner near a fire scene in the Bitterroot Valley 3, separate times without ever planning it, and neither of us pretending it was strange anymore by the third time. It was an argument over a burn pattern in a barn fire outside Kalispell that got heated enough that another investigator asked if we needed a minute, and both of us saying no at the same time, too fast, in a way that made the other investigator raise an eyebrow and walk away without another word. What changed everything, or at least started changing it, was a fire outside Livingston that killed no one but destroyed 6 structures, including a small workshop that had belonged to an old woodworker named Hollis Denny, who had died 2 years earlier and whose son had kept the shop standing as a kind of memorial. Joe and I were both hired again, competing firms, same fire, and this time the county wanted a joint report because the case was headed for litigation and they wanted something both sides could agree to. That meant 3 days of working the scene together instead of parallel to each other, sharing notes instead of guarding them, sitting in the same truck cab going over measurements while rain came down sideways outside. On the second night, in a motel room we were not sharing, though it was close enough down the hall that I could hear her television through the wall, I lay awake thinking about the way she had cried, just for a second, standing in what used to be Hollis Denny's workshop, looking at a burned bandsaw that must have reminded her of something or someone she never explained. I had not asked. I had just stood next to her, close enough that our shoulders almost touched, and let the silence be the only comfort either of us knew how to offer. And I remember thinking, lying there listening to her television murmur through drywall, that I did not want to be the kind of man who let a woman cry 10 feet away from him and call it professional distance. That was the same week Joe picked up Walt's gauge for the first time. We were packing up the truck after the joint report was filed, and the gauge had fallen out of my jacket pocket onto the seat, and before I could grab it, she had it in her hand, turning it over, running her thumb along the worn brass the same way I always did without noticing I did it. I braced for the discomfort I always felt when anyone else touched it, the tightening in my chest that made me want to reach out and take it back. It didn't come. Instead, I watched her flip it open with a familiarity that startled me, and she said, without looking up, "This measures char depth in eighths, not tenths, doesn't it?" Older calibration. I asked how she knew that. She said her own grandfather had been a timber cruiser in Idaho for 40 years, and had a gauge almost like it, and that she used to sit on his porch as a kid watching him measure trees before they were cut, learning without knowing she was learning. She handed it back to me carefully, like she understood exactly what she was handing back, and said, "Your Walt sounds like he knew what he was doing. Nobody had ever called him mine before." It undid something in me that I did not expect to come undone in a gravel parking lot in the rain. After that, I stopped pretending Rule 3 was holding. I did not act on it. I told myself there was a difference between admitting a thing to yourself and doing anything about it, and I clung to that difference for another 5 months. Through 2 more shared fire scenes. Through a bid we both lost to a third firm out of Idaho. Through a birthday of hers I found out about only because another investigator mentioned it in passing, and I spent an embarrassing amount of time deciding whether sending her a text was something a competitor would do. I sent it. She sent back a single word, "Softy," which felt like the warmest insult I had ever received. What nobody tells you is that rules built to protect you from repeating your worst mistake do not actually know the difference between your worst mistake and something entirely different standing right in front of you. I had built Rule 3, assuming that wanting Joe would feel like the beginning of my marriage falling apart all over again, like choosing smoke over a person, like the particular loneliness of loving something more than someone. But it didn't feel like that at all. It felt like the opposite. Joe did not compete with my attention the way the job had competed with Renata's. Joe was the job, in a strange, sideways way, and being near her did not pull me away from the parts of myself I valued most. It sharpened them. I found myself wanting to be better at reading a scene, not to beat her to the answer, but because I wanted her to respect the work, the way you want to bring your best self to someone whose opinion has quietly become the one that matters most. And still, I did nothing, because Rule 2 was still standing, unbroken, and some stubborn part of me believed that as long as I kept one rule intact, I had not really lost control of anything. That was the rule about the gauge, about not letting anyone else's presence tangle itself into the one uncomplicated thing I had left. But a rule you keep only to prove you can keep it is already halfway broken, and I think some part of me knew that the day she handed the gauge back to me in the rain, and I felt nothing but gratitude, instead of the old tightening in my chest. Which brings me to Missoula, and the conference, and the hotel that mixed up our rooms. The Wildfire Investigators Regional Conference happens every year in Missoula, and every year it draws maybe 200 people from 4 states into one downtown hotel for 3 days of seminars. Nobody really wants to sit through and hallway conversations that actually matter more than the seminars do. Joe and I had both registered separately through our separate firms, the way we always did, and neither of us had any reason to think our rooms would be connected in any way. But the hotel's booking system, apparently, had merged 2 blocks of reservations that week because of some software update gone wrong, and by the time anyone noticed, half the conference had been double booked into rooms meant for one person, and the hotel was scrambling to sort it out with apologies and free breakfast vouchers that did nothing to solve the actual problem, which was that there were not enough rooms in Missoula that week to fix their mistake cleanly. I found out at the front desk, standing in a line that moved slower with every apology the clerk offered, that my room had been assigned as a shared room, and that the other name on the reservation was Josephine Calloway. I remember reading her name on the little printed slip and feeling my stomach do something complicated, half dread and half a feeling I did not want to examine too closely in a hotel lobby full of my professional colleagues. The clerk offered to try to find something else, said it might take an hour, might take until midnight, might not happen at all given how full the city was that week for 2 conferences and a college homecoming game. Joe walked up behind me in that moment, saw the slip in my hand, read it upside down, and said, before I could say anything at all, "Well, that explains why my key card didn't work on the room I thought was mine." I remember the particular way she said it, amused rather than alarmed, like the universe had made a scheduling error that was somehow beneath her concern. We stood there a moment, the 2 of us, in the middle of a lobby full of people who knew us both as rivals, weighing whether to make a scene out of asking for a fix or just accept the room and figure it out. Joe made the decision before I did. She told the clerk not to worry about it, that we'd take the room as assigned, and thanked her for trying. GM. I remember looking at her, surprised, and she just shrugged and said, "It's one night. We've shared worse spaces than a hotel room." She meant the fire scenes, the trucks, the diner booths, all the small close quarters our overlapping careers had put us in over the past year and a half. I told myself she was right. I told myself it meant nothing more than practicality, the same practicality that had her drinking gas station coffee and complaining about it every single time. That's how we ended up in the elevator together, holding room key cards that worked for the same door, neither of us saying much, both of us aware of something neither of us had named, yet sitting quietly between us like a third passenger. And that's how we ended up standing in that doorway, me holding my duffel and my case of gauges, watching her set her bag down at the foot of a bed that was, unmistakably, only one bed, wide and low under a window that looked out on the black ridgeline above the city, hearing her say, "Guess we have no choice," in that same flat voice she used on burn patterns and insurance adjusters and, apparently, on me. I did not say any of what I was thinking. What I said was, "There's got to be a rollaway somewhere in this hotel," and I meant it, because even with everything I had let myself admit to myself over the past year and a half, I was not going to be the man who used a booking error as an excuse to end up in a bed with a woman I was still, technically, competing against for a contract that would be decided in less than a month. Jo looked at me for a long moment, and something in her face shifted, not disappointment exactly, but something close to it, quickly folded away and replaced with her usual steadiness. She said, "Sure, ask downstairs. I'm not going to fight you on being a gentleman." But there was an edge under it, faint, the kind of edge you only hear if you have spent a year and a half learning the particular music of someone's voice. I called downstairs. The clerk, apologetic again, told me every rollaway in the building was already out, every spare room already gone, and that the best she could offer was a folding cot they kept in the maintenance closet for emergencies, which she would have someone bring up within the hour. I thanked her and hung up and told Jo, and she nodded like she had expected exactly that answer. "A cot," she said. "Living the high life, Everett." I told her I'd take the cot and she could have the bed, and she said, without missing a beat, that she wasn't going to make a man my age sleep on a piece of canvas held together with duct tape while she stretched out on a queen mattress, and that we would figure something out once the cot showed up. There was a practicality in how she said it that made the whole situation feel almost ordinary. The way she handled everything, and I found myself grateful for that, because it let me breathe instead of standing there, turning the moment into something bigger than it needed to be. The cot arrived about 40 minutes later, carried up by a tired-looking maintenance man who apologized twice for the wait, and once it was set up along the far wall under the window, the room felt smaller instead of larger, the way a small room does when you add one more piece of furniture that everyone has to walk around. We ordered food from the place across the street because neither of us wanted to face the conference dinner that night, all small talk and business cards, and we ate sitting on opposite ends of the room, her on the bed with her back against the headboard, me on the edge of the cot, both of us balancing paper containers of noodles on our knees like teenagers at a sleepover neither of us had asked for. And that was when the conversation turned toward Walt again, because she asked, out of nowhere, whether I still talked to him on long drives, and I told her I did, more than I probably should admit to a woman who bid against me for contracts. She told me something that she had never told me before, which was that her grandfather, the timber cruiser, had died when she was 19, the same year she decided to go into fire investigation instead of the accounting degree her parents wanted for her, and that she had never told anyone at work that the two things were connected. She said she thought, at the time, that becoming someone who studied burned forests instead of standing timber was a way of staying close to him, without admitting that's what she was doing. I told her that sounded exactly like something I would do, and she said, quietly, "I know. That's part of why I noticed you." I did not know what to do with a sentence like that, so I did what I always do when I don't know what to do, which is ask a technical question, and I asked her about the char pattern on the Livingston fire, the one at Hollis Denny's workshop, and whether she had ever figured out what made her cry that day. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said her grandfather used to have a bandsaw just like the one that had burned, and that she hadn't expected the memory to hit her the way it did, standing in a stranger's ruined workshop 3 states from home. We talked longer than either of us meant to, about small things and then bigger ones, about the parts of the job that wear you down and the parts that keep you doing it anyway, about the particular ache of being good at reading disaster and less good at reading the people standing right in front of you. Somewhere in that conversation, without either of us deciding to, the topic of the contract we were both bidding for came up, the one that would decide which of our firms got hired for a 3-county reconstruction assessment starting in the fall. Jo said, carefully, that she hoped whoever won it, the other one wouldn't take it personally, and I told her I had been telling myself the same thing for months, that I hoped I could lose to her without it changing anything between us, and that saying it out loud made me realize how much I had already decided mattered more than the contract itself. That was the moment I should have said more, but I didn't. Not that night. Because some old habit of caution kept my mouth shut, even as everything in me wanted to close the distance between the cot and the bed. Instead, we said goodnight, somewhere close to midnight, and I lay on that cot, listening to her breathing even out across the room, thinking about Rule 3 and how thin it had worn, thinking about Rule 2 and the gauge sitting in my jacket pocket on the nightstand between us, thinking that for the first time since Walt died I did not feel like the only person in the world who understood what that gauge meant. The unmistakable moment, the one that could not be walked back from, happened the next morning. Quiet and small the way real moments usually are, nothing like the dramatic turns in the stories people tell about falling in love. I woke before her, the way I always do, and found the gauge had slipped from my jacket pocket onto the nightstand sometime in the night. Joe was still asleep, one arm thrown over the edge of the bed, and in the gray early light, I noticed something I had never let myself notice before, which was the small, careful way she had folded her own field notebook and set it beside mine on the nightstand. The two notebooks stacked together like they belonged to the same investigation, instead of two competing ones. I sat on the edge of the cot, looking at that stack of notebooks for longer than I want to admit, and something in me, some rule I had carried since Renata, some fear I had carried since Walt died, just quietly let go. When Joe woke up, she found me sitting there, with the gauge open in my hand, turning it over the way I always did when I was thinking hard about something that mattered. She asked what I was measuring. I told her I wasn't measuring anything, that I was just holding it, and she gave me a look that told me she understood exactly what that meant, because she had spent a year and a half learning the particular music of my silences the same way I had learned hers. She got up, crossed the small distance of that room in 3 steps, and sat down next to me on the edge of the cot, close enough that our shoulders touched the way they had touched in Hollis Denny's workshop, except this time neither of us pulled away. I told her, finally, all of it. I told her about Rule 3, the one about not falling for a competitor because Renata had taught me love and work don't survive getting tangled together. I told her I had broken that rule about 4 months ago and had just been too stubborn to say so out loud. I told her about Rule 2, the one about never letting the gauge get tangled up in anything that might end the way my marriage ended, and that somewhere in the last year and a half she had become the one person besides Walt I trusted to hold it without it feeling like a risk. She listened to all of it without interrupting, which was not like her, and when I finished, she took the gauge gently from my hand, turned it over once, and said, "Your rules were never really about the job, Everett. They were about being scared of losing something the way you lost her. I'm not her." I told her I knew that now. She said, "Good. Because I've been waiting a year and a half for you to catch up to something I figured out in a parking lot in the rain." I want to say something happened in that room that morning that would satisfy the version of this story people expect. Some grand declaration, some kiss lit by early morning light through a Missoula hotel window. What actually happened was smaller than that and truer for it. She leaned her head against my shoulder for a moment, the two of us sitting on the edge of a cheap folding cot with a brass gauge between us, and she said, the barrier we had built our whole professional relationship around. The contract, the competition, the fear of what mixing love and work might cost us both, could be handled the way we handled everything else, honestly and out loud, instead of silently and separate. She said if one of us won the contract and the other didn't, we would figure it out the way two people who trusted each other figured things out, not the way two strangers pretending not to want something figured things out. It was not dramatic. It was just true. And it landed harder than any dramatic gesture could have. We spent the rest of that conference the way we had spent the last year and a half, working parallel to each other in seminar rooms, instead of burn scars, except this time we sat next to each other on purpose, instead of by accident, and neither of us pretended otherwise when a colleague noticed and raised an eyebrow. The contract was decided 3 weeks later. Her firm won it, I told her, when she called to tell me that I was glad. And I meant it in a way that surprised even me, because losing a bid to Joe Calloway had somehow stopped feeling like losing anything at all. These days I still drive out to burn scars alone most weeks, because that part of the job hasn't changed and I wouldn't want it to. But Joe and I share a small office now, above a hardware store in a town halfway between where our two firms used to sit, a compromise neither of us fought very hard against once we admitted we wanted it. Basin Fire Consulting still exists on paper, and so does my old independent practice. But most weeks we work the same fires, side by side instead of 40 feet apart, and the county has mostly stopped asking for two competing reports, since they've figured out the two of us agree on almost everything now, including the things we don't say out loud. The gauge still lives in my jacket pocket, worn smooth in the same spot my thumb has always rested, except now, some mornings, it lives in Joe's jacket pocket instead, because she started carrying it on days I stayed back to write reports. And I found I did not mind at all, watching her walk out to a scene with Walt's tool folded in her hand, the way he once folded it in his own. Last month, out at a small structure fire on the edge of town, nothing serious, no one hurt. I watched her crouch at the char line the way she always does, headlamp on even though it was noon, and she called out a measurement to me the way she used to when we were still pretending to be rivals. Except this time she followed it with my name, soft, like it belonged in the sentence. Nobody threw us a party when it started. There was no ring, no announcement at a conference podium, nothing anyone would put in a report. Just a Tuesday evening, ordinary as any other, when Joe showed up at my place with 2 coffees, one of them the gas station kind she still complains about, and set the gauge down on my kitchen table between us like it belonged there as much as either of us did. We sat and went over notes from a scene we'd both worked that day, arguing gently about a wind pattern neither of us fully agreed on, and somewhere in the middle of that ordinary argument I realized this was the whole thing. This was what I had been afraid to want for 3 years, not a grand rescue but a woman across a table who read fires the way I did and read me better than I read myself. I still think about what Walt told me the first year he trained me, that fire never lies, it only waits for someone patient enough to read it right. I spent a long time thinking that lesson only applied to burned buildings and scorched hillsides. Looking back now, I think he meant something wider than that, something about paying attention to what's actually there instead of what you're afraid to find. It took me a year and a half and a hotel booking error to finally read the pattern sitting right in front of me, plain as any char line on a kitchen floor. Joe says the mixed-up reservation was the best mistake either of our companies ever made, and most mornings, watching her make coffee too strong and complain about it anyway, I think she's right.